What is going on? It is Nate the Game Guy coming back with another video at hand. Today I would figure I would kick things off with a relatively interesting video guide on how to get started as a brand new video game collector, right? I've been a game collector for a very long time. I have almost over 3,300 games in the collection. I have 2 complete sets, and it's a hobby that I've been very passionate about over the years. I've had a lot of fun. However, it's been a lot of work keeping track of all of my games and all the stuff that comes along with being a game collector with a personal game room, right? It's a very fun hobby, but there are definitely some things I think that the new game collector should know, and I think there are some things that the new game collector should also be reminded of, right? So without further ado, let's jump right into this video guide. So when it comes to starting a video game collection for the first time, right, I see a lot of new time collectors on a lot of these guides similar to this, right, where they'll be like, oh, how do I get started, or which game should I buy first? Is there a specific game I should buy first, right? And the answer is actually pretty simple, and I'm not trying to laugh to be mean, rude, disrespectful, make fun of anybody, right? But like I said, the answer is very simple. You just buy games. Just get started. Just start buying games that you want to buy, right? I mean, it's not that hard. It's literally just like, if you want to get yourself a cup of coffee, you just buy yourself a cup of coffee, or buy groceries, or buy clothes for yourself, right? It's not that hard. I mean, all you got to do is just, I don't know if it's like your game store, eBay, whatever, just buy the game or games that you want to buy and just buy it, right? I mean, I know it's dumb to say at the beginning of a video like this, but unfortunately, there are some people that I believe truly do need to hear this. The next thing that I want to talk about is what type of game collector do you want to be? Are you somebody who just wants to buy games that you actually like, you actually want to play, and actually have some interest in? Or are you planning to be a completionist, where essentially any game you don't own immediately goes into your collection and you try to complete as many sets as possible? Doesn't matter if it's something like Madden NFL 2008 or something more rare and obscure such as Chibi Robo on GameCube, right? Basically, what a complete set is, for those that don't know what it is, it essentially means that you own every game ever released for an entire game system's library, A through Z. Right? So for example, I happen to own a complete set for the Wii U and a complete set for the Hyperscan. I own all the games ever released for both systems. Now, there really is no correct or incorrect way in terms of being an actual game collector. Essentially what it is, you just do whatever works best for you. So if you want to do a few complete sets here and there, go for it. Or if you just don't even want to do complete sets at all and you just care about having just the games that you want to play, that works too. There is no correct or incorrect way about going about it. I'm a little bit of both. Sometimes for some systems, I just want to buy games that I genuinely like, and then other systems that I really do like, and sometimes dislike, depending on how cheap it is or whatever, right? That sometimes I will like to complete the set for. So just a few things to keep in mind and a few extra terms and some terminology to give out to some new video game collectors. The next thing that is absolutely worth mentioning when you are jumping in as a first-time video game collector is space. This hobby is extremely space intensive. There are no questions asked about that, right? So one of the greatest tips that I have ever heard from one of the game collectors I used to follow, unfortunately, I don't remember which one said it, but I did hear it somewhere, and that is, don't buy games just to fill up space. You will absolutely fill up space, so just don't buy games just to fill up space. Trust me, you'll do it over the long term. Now, another thing that's worth mentioning is with completionists, I've noticed that in my opinion, I feel like completionists tend to have a high tendency rate of eventually downsizing at some point, where One completionist I used to follow was Nintendo Toyser or Nintendo Toysler. I forget which one it was. And essentially he had multiple complete sets across multiple Nintendo consoles and Sega consoles. And then just one day he decided to just sell off a huge portion of his collection and then just decided to keep which games he plans to either play for himself or which ones he just genuinely likes. So that is one thing to keep in mind if you do decide to become a completionist too. Another thing to determine too when it comes to space is, are you planning to have a dedicated game room just like this? Are you planning to just get a bunch of storage bins and just throw a bunch of games in and keep them somewhere and that's your game collection? When it comes to that, you really have to keep in mind with space too, is because you want to have a healthy mindset about it. You don't want to have like multiple game rooms where it's rooms just filled with games. You've got games in the hallway, games in your kitchen cabinet, your car trunk, right? You don't want to get to the point where it's like you got your own special edition on Hoarders where it's like you people got to navigate through different mazes in your house to get to the bathroom, the kitchen, all that good stuff, right? So when you are jumping in to game collecting for the very first time, try to think long term. Do you think you're going to have the amount of space, and is the amount of space that you're going to have support your expectations of what you want to do, especially if you're a completionist as well? It's definitely something I got to keep track of in mind when it comes to my personal game collection, but I cannot stress this enough. Space, space, space. You got to manage it, and you got to have a healthy mindset about it. The next thing to put into consideration too when going into game collecting is prices and which systems you're going to be collecting for. Are you going to be going for something more collectible such as GameCube, Sega Saturn, Sega CD? Or are you going to be going for something more common such as Wii, PS2, 360, original Xbox, PS3, systems that are relatively easy to collect for and not going to break the bank? Those are a few things to consider when starting into game collecting. Now, most game collectors have a variety when it comes to which games they have in their collection. They'll have some Wii, they'll have some GameCube, Sega CD, all that, right? So when you are collecting, it's definitely nice to have a variety, but it is also to keep in mind too when you're starting out, going for the most collectible, the most expensive games or systems to collect for may not be practical. So you may want to start off small and collect for something such as Wii, original Xbox, PS3, PS4, Xbox One, games that aren't going to break the bank and systems that aren't going to break the bank when you're collecting for them. Those are a few things to consider when starting game collecting. After all, there is a reason as to why I have almost 600 PS2 games, but I have only about 5 Sega CD games. So when you are starting game collecting, it's definitely worth considering where you want to start at first. My personal advice, start with the more common stuff and the cheaper stuff, is because that's what's going to help build up your collection a lot smoother and a lot easier in the beginning. Now, one thing that is definitely worth mentioning in this video is collecting video games for the sole purpose of investment. And what do I mean by this? I mean, if somebody buys a copy of, say, Sonic CD, and they're expecting it to be a $300 plus game in 10 years. They sell their copy, they get their ROI on it, and that's their investment. In my opinion, it's a terrible idea for anybody to go into game collecting just for the sole purpose of investment and expecting that they're going to have all this money later on down the line. Most video games actually depreciate in value, and while it is true that there are games that will go up in value and that there are games that will be collectible, that's not a guarantee. And I'll give an example. Back in 2023, Panzer Dragoon Saga for a while was a $2,000 game complete in box. Last time I checked, it's now worth half of that. Now, there's definitely no way for anybody to accurately predict that. And sure, you could even say that there's an argument to that too when it comes to any type of investment. But if I were looking for investment, me personally, I would be looking into the stock market, index funds, mutual funds, rental properties, right? Things that have a more practical background and things that have more of a proven track record to actually be a good investment. Now, I'm definitely not an investment expert, but if I were in the position where I was looking to go into a new investment, I would be looking into those things rather than video games. So if you want to take my personal advice, avoid game collecting if you are only looking for investment. Now, this is a subject that a lot of people think about when going into game collecting for the first time, is budget, right? It's definitely no secret that this can be a very expensive hobby. A lot of the most collectible games can easily be $300, $500, $5,000. Heck, Stadium Events, which is the rarest game on the NES, last time I saw, which was back in 2016, is a $40,000 game complete in box. There's no secret that this can be a very expensive hobby. Now, with most game collectors, they do go into a little bit of reselling. And what do I mean by that? Essentially, what they'll do is they'll go to garage sales, thrift stores, estate sales, things of that nature. And what they'll do is say they find a game that either they already have or they're just not interested in. And say they find a game such as Super Mario Sunshine, they find it for like $2 to $5. They decide to throw it up online to sell on either eBay, Mercari, or whatever, and basically they recoup their money back and they use that profit to basically fund their collection. Now, that's definitely a very good idea to funding your collection, and it's definitely something I've been involved with too, with a little bit of reselling when it comes to building my collection. I would argue a decent portion of my collection was actually funded this way. And it is definitely a great way to fund a collection. However, here's some food for thought too. Time is money. And while this may not be the most fun and exciting thing to say, if for whatever reason you're just thinking that this is out of your budget or whatever, but you're really wanting to get into game collecting, think about maybe getting another part-time job or building up a side hustle or some other form of income. Because think about this, how many times can I guarantee this will happen? How many times will somebody go to a garage sale or spend an entire weekend going to people's houses and literally they come with nothing because nobody was selling video games or they were just selling video games for way too much and they weren't willing to negotiate? That's basically an entire day loss, right? So if you have like a part-time job, sure, it's not as fun and exciting as going to someone's yard sale and finding some game for only $5 when it's worth about $100. But like I said, at least if you have like that extra income or that job or whatever, that's money that's guaranteed to actually fund your collection. Just some food for thought to consider when going into game collecting when it comes to your budget and income when funding your game collection. Now, this is definitely one of the most important subjects when talking about going into video game collecting for the first time, is properly storing your video games. Video games are not indestructible. They can deteriorate over time. And one of the things that you have to be aware about when going into game collecting is disc rot. Disc rot is when a disc begins to deteriorate, rot away from basically old age, weather, humidity, poor disc manufacturing, and it's not limited to video games. That's all media that's on disc, right? So that's definitely something to think about. One of the best ways to store your games, right, or actually the best ways to store your games, is to actually have them vertically on a shelf, because it actually makes it not as vulnerable to disc rot. While if you have it like horizontal, that actually, believe it or not, makes it more vulnerable to disc rot. Make sure to keep your games in a room with room temperature from 68 degrees to 75 degrees Fahrenheit. Don't keep it in like the garage or like some backyard shed or whatever where there's like no AC or whatever. Also, keep in mind with humidity too, like don't store these things in the bathroom when you're taking a shower all the time. You want to make sure that these things are in between 30% and 60% humidity in your room. If it goes below 30%, it's not a big deal. It's not really going to do anything to your games. Meanwhile, if you have your games at above 60%, me personally, I like to keep it below 50%. Your games definitely run a higher risk of some long-term damage. The best way, if you happen to have a lot of humidity in the house, make sure you get like a dehumidifier. And I don't mean like a small dehumidifier, but don't get one of those big honking commercial dehumidifiers either. Just like a standard room dehumidifier. If you happen to have humidity, that's a problem. Also use a hygrometer. That will definitely measure the weather in the room, or not weather, but the temperature in the room, and also the humidity in the room. Very important things to consider and think about when going into game collecting. Also, keep in mind when properly storing your games, make sure that they're not in direct sunlight, because not only will the direct sunlight actually cause fading to the games, but it can also speed up the process of disc rot as well, and even actually cause a little bit of disc rot too. So avoid direct sunlight with these. One last thing I want to cover before I wrap this video up is sometimes it's actually better to buy video games online or from your mom and pop game store rather than just going to garage sales and thrift stores and all that, right? So what do I mean by that is sometimes video games are actually more susceptible to disc rot. And what I mean by that, GameCube, Dreamcast, Sega Saturn, Sega CD, those game consoles are actually more susceptible to disc rot. Now, I won't cover all the details about disc rot in this video, but I will plan to cover it in a future video, which I will definitely link at some point in this video. So what I mean by this is sometimes you want to just make sure that you have a little bit of an exit strategy in case if you happen to buy a game that happens to have disc rot. So for example, you go on the eBay or go to your mom and pop game store, you buy the game, you make sure that it's all good, and make sure that there's some form of a return policy there, that if for whatever reason you don't like it, you can return it, no questions asked, it's all good. You check your game out, if it's got disc rot, return it. End of story. Another reason that you want to consider buying online or buying from your mom and pop game store is that while cartridge-based games are almost indestructible, there are games that have little batteries inside of them, especially the ones that use save files. So games such as Ocarina of Time, Pokemon Yellow, Super Mario World, games that actually allow you to actually save your progress. These games are getting old, and so are the batteries. Eventually, these batteries are going to die. Once these batteries die, you will no longer be able to access the save feature with these games. So if you happen to buy these games from a seller who is actually changing out the battery, or buying these games from somebody who is actually changing the batteries out at like your local game store or whatever, that's one thing to consider too, as that. So when you are buying some of these more games that are more vulnerable to disc rot and also batteries dying out, that's definitely something to consider too. Unless if you happen to have good soldering skills and you're willing to open up those cartridges, desolder those batteries, solder them back in, and you're good. If you don't have those skills, you might want to stick with my suggestion. Also keep in mind when buying disc-based games, make sure that you're buying games that don't have scratches on the label. I'm not sure if you can see with the camera focus, but there's clearly some scratches along this part of the disc right here, because sometimes the scratches can actually damage the data actually stored below the disc, because the data is actually stored right below the label of the disc, not the bottom of the disc. Also keep in mind too, when buying games, make sure that there aren't any cracks along this inner ring, because not only do the cracks also make the disc more vulnerable to disc rot, but it can actually cause some long-term damage too with your disc when you're ejecting and not ejecting and all of that, where essentially the game will actually completely crack. And of course, make sure to avoid games where they have like a ring sticker in the middle, because all that is just covering the cracks and actually keeping the game basically held in place. Alright, and I'll conclude the video right here. I hope everybody found this video to be extremely helpful, especially to first-time video game collectors. If you have any comments, thoughts or concerns, feel free to comment in the comment section down below. Did you find the video useful? Please be sure to give the video a like. It helps boost the video in the YouTube algorithm so more viewers can watch videos just like this. And of course, subscribe to more content just like this that you'll be able to see in the near future. Hope you guys enjoyed the video, and I'll be seeing you guys next time.